and political developments, particularly in the Western democracies of Europe, the UK, as well as the US. So let me repeat then. So on the one hand, the idea of universalism, as well as many notions of justice, which are very central to rights, has a broad foundation and can be found all over the world. But at the same time, or on the other hand, the specific idea of rights is based in certain social and political developments. The American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789 both represent crucial developments for civil and political rights as understood in the late 18th century. So I make that distinction as understood because there were many limits and many aspects of civil and political rights introduced at that time, which have since been criticized and amended as we came through 19th and 20th century. There were unquestionably limitations to these revolutions and their constructions of rights. Notably, there was discrimination against women. Rights were limited to a small percentage of the population and ignored the existence of exploitative institutions such as colonialism and slavery. When we move to the socialist and workers' movements in the 19th and early 20th century, we can see a shift towards securing political and economic guarantees of the kind that we will come at present to understand as economic rights. But at the time in which the labor movements, socialism, as well as far-reaching revolutions in the Imperial Russia, which gave birth to the Soviet Union, and the mid-century revolution in China, emphasized political and economic guarantees of a different nature than those that had been the focus of the 18th century democratic revolutions. You will undoubtedly also be introduced to the legacies of World War I and World War II and their political aftermaths for the creation of the UDHR and the human rights system. We will not be spending much time on this in this particular course, but simply to note that these historical events and formalization of rights and the development of the UN human rights system are also crucial to the continued expansion and refinement of our ideas about human rights. In this next section, we begin to shift towards the chapter from the Goodhart textbook by Anthony Langlois on the philosophical foundations of rights. And here now we can look at this issue of specific histories of rights alongside the moral justifications which we covered earlier. So the claim to the universality of human rights comes from this moral justification, what we might also think of as the philosophical and ethical foundation. But it got joined with the specific histories of politics in the late 18th century through the development of liberal political ideas and the changes brought about through the democratic revolutions of 18th century Europe and the US. Just a reminder, the latter was, until that time, a collection of colonies that owed its obedience and was integrally a part of the British Empire. It was, for all intents and purposes, English colonies that emerged the United States of America. What we think of today as universal human rights emerged in no small way from Western philosophy and politics. Now, this is not an uncontested or simple statement. I want to be clear that this is one interpretation, but it is the one that Langlois and many others lean towards in English language scholarship, not because they believe that human rights remain Western or in the control, in quotes, somehow of Western democratic histories and traditions alone, but rather they make their interpretations based upon their reading of political history, in which the terms rights emerge in ways most closely linked with the ways they are used in liberal democratic regimes around the world today. So we could say that these is a reading of the modern history of rights that locates them in particular political developments, notably in the late 18th century democratic revolutions and in the political philosophy of liberalism, which emerged starting in the 17th century, particularly among the writings of English and Scottish political philosophers. So the universality of rights comes from the belief by rights advocates that human rights should be the moral norms by which human behavior is judged, and the standard by which governments are judged to be legitimate or not. That is, this idea that the human rights are universal is tied to a modern concept of ethical behavior and the legitimacy of governments. So those governments that violate or abuse rights are thought to be not legitimate, illegitimate. Now, from many directions, we can see that these statements raise questions. Certainly, there are other values which people hold to be standards of human behavior. And there are challenges as well from giving the state the role in rights of both a central actor in codifying those rights, in legalizing them, and supposedly in protecting and promoting them, when we know how frequently states or governments are either directly responsible for their violation of rights or sanction their violation in the name of things like national security, economic development, or nationalism. So there are challenges from every angle to the universality of rights claims. Now, Anthony Langlois, the author of that chapter on the philosophical foundations of rights, reminds us that when we consider the human rights movement, we need to be aware that it is a political movement. Here's a direct quote from him. "The rhetoric of human rights can sometimes obscure the many ways in which the human rights movement is a political movement. The talk of universalism, of common standards for humankind, and of inalienable and self-evident rights can give the impression that all the big questions about human rights are settled. But they are not. Human rights is a controversial and contested idea."